Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, Navigating the New Normal, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society and the economy, real estate and technology, medicine and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Plout. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, AFRMC, a 501c3 National American Charitable Organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petach Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence. It serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. And now, during this time of war, the hospital is a front line of Israel's defenses, treats the many wounded Israeli soldiers and civilian casualties. We remain in awe of the doctors and nurses at Israel's Rabin Medical Center in the ER, ICU, and orthopedic departments as they respond to the October 7th atrocities. Please support our mission. Join our community of friends. Visit American Friends of Rabin Medical Center via our website and social media outlets on Twitter and Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube, and on our Facebook page and discussion group. And now, on to today's program. Today's Global Connections topic is, what's next in Washington, D.C. in 2025? Thank you to our very special guests, E.J. Dionne Jr., Chair and Senior Fellow of Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution and columnist at the Washington Post, Tamara Keith, White House correspondent at National Public Radio, and Evan Osnos, staff writer at The New Yorker and Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. And now, Global Connections with Robert Siegel.
Thank you, Josh. Talking about the future in Washington is complicated by the confusion that describes the present. Some examples. One actually touches on Rabin Medical Center. That's where hostages freed from Gaza have been flown for medical attention. They were freed under a deal that Donald Trump's Middle East envoy, working in tandem with the Biden administration, even before the handoff of presidential power, pressured Israel to accept over the protests of the Israeli far right. But if that signaled a mood of cooperation, not for long. We soon heard an argument over bragging rights for peacemaking, and President Trump spoke about the transfer of Palestinians from Gaza to neighboring Arab states. That would mark an extreme change in U.S. policy and a triumph for the Israeli far right. What should we make of the new Secretary of Defense being confirmed despite a historically slim resume? His job, he says, is to refocus the military on its core mission, which is to defend the country's borders with lethal force. But the first order of business for the new administration was to send 1,500 more troops to the explicitly non-lethal business of backing up civilian law enforcement along the border with Mexico. President Trump has inveighed against our entanglement in foreign wars, but in his inaugural address, he offered, as one measure of American greatness restored, expanding our territory, and he has publicly threatened Panama and Greenland with military force. He has issued innumerable executive orders, dismissals, declarations of emergency, removals of security protection for former aides turned critics. He has made a buyout offer to hundreds of thousands, if not a couple of million, federal employees, and announced a freeze on federal grants and loans that led to chaos and a challenge in federal court before it was, we think, rescinded. Where is all this headed? Toward the oligarchy that Joe Biden warned of? Is there a major political realignment underway? And what kind of populism do we make of a president who is so close to so many billionaires? And what will the Democrats do in response to all of this? Well, we have lots of questions, and three superb journalists on hand to address them. You can submit a question to them by typing it into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we may be able to get to your question during the second half hour of our panel, the discussion period. Tamara Keith leads off now. She has been a White House correspondent for NPR for over 10 years. She hosts the NPR Politics podcast, and she appears weekly on the PBS NewsHour with Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report. Tam, good to see you again, always.
Good to be back with you.
First, I want to ask you about this freeze that horrified some states who need federal funds to provide things like food stamps and Meals on Wheels. Democrats point to a federal law and a Supreme Court decision, both from the 1970s, that essentially ban a president from refusing to spend money that's been lawfully appropriated by Congress. Was the White House looking, or is it still looking, for a big constitutional showdown over this?
I think it's looking for several constitutional showdowns, in fact. As you might remember, the president also signed that executive action to end birthright citizenship. In both of these cases, the White House says that they are right on the law and that they would like to test it, that they would like to take it all the way. In terms of the pause, it created widespread confusion, which the White House then blamed on other people being confused and not them confusing everyone.
And I think he also threw in some blame on the media for confusing people about this.
Yes, in fact, in essence, saying that the media, by listening to Democratic members of Congress and nonprofit organizations and everyone else who was hair on fire about it, that we were in fact making there be more confusion because the White House was not confused. And what we saw was, and time is a flat circle right now. Time is really hard to comprehend. But on Monday night, the Office of Management and Budget issued this memo. And then throughout the day yesterday, they issued clarifications to the memo, repeatedly adding, "Oh no, this isn't affected, and that isn't affected, and how could you say that's affected?" And then come today, there is a new memo that rescinds the last memo. But then there are statements from the press secretary and then background from the White House going even further to say, well, it had the effect we wanted. And we're just doing this because it was held up in court. And we are still going to cut all this spending, which gets to the original legal question that you mentioned, which is it legal or constitutional for the president of the United States to decide that spending that was appropriated by Congress is out of line with his views, and so therefore he doesn't have to do it?
You covered the first Trump White House. Does this one feel like just a continuation of where Donald Trump left off 4 years ago, or is there something different about it?
Well, I guess what I would say is, if you think back 8 years ago, think of someone like Stephen Miller. He's the one of the president's top advisors, immigration hardliner. He was a young congressional aide without a lot of experience 8 years ago, who'd been working for a backbencher of a senator. He came into the White House. He had a lot of things he wanted to do. He didn't precisely know how to do it. There were lots of people like him who didn't exactly know how to use the levers of power, didn't fully understand the government. Well, the people, and at the same time, there were also a lot of chaos agents, like a Steve Bannon or Kellyanne Conway, multiple power centers, and they were all fighting with each other, and they were all leaking to the press. This White House now, 8 years later, is less leaky. There aren't these sort of feuding power centers. They're all going in the same direction. Now, this memo from the Office of Management and Budget is an example of them putting out a policy and then trying to clean it up and explain it later instead of having a real rollout. Very reminiscent of lots of things that happened in the first Trump administration. But by and large, they have been writing these executive orders and actions and memos. They have been planning this step by step. Someone like Stephen Miller created a think tank, raised money, and spent 4 years essentially plotting what he would do if he got back in the White House. So they do have more experience. They have fewer chaos agents, though they do still have the chaos agent in chief, which is President Trump, who doesn't always stay on message, and doesn't always stick with what the original plan was.
Donald Trump and the Republicans won last fall. Most people say, broadly speaking, on two issues. One was immigration, the broken immigration system, and the other was the cost of living and inflation. Actually, the price of eggs has gone up. It hasn't gone down in the Trump administration for avian flu reasons. But is there some sense that there actually is an economic program here that's going to address inflation?
Yeah, as you say, egg prices are off the charts. And yesterday, the White House blamed Joe Biden for that. There you go. No mention of the avian influenza, but that is a very real issue. What the White House is saying is that this could take a while. Their plan to bring down inflation or to bring down prices, the cost of living. Their plan is to cut regulations and to increase the availability of fossil fuels. And in theory, those things could, eventually bring down prices or make prices go up less quickly for things like housing, building new houses or something. Reducing regulation could make something smoother for business. But prices, inflation doesn't actually go in the opposite direction. It just slows down. And so people who are mad that things are 20% more than they were 5 years ago, they're always going to be 20% more than they were 5 years ago. They're just going to get used to it at some point. But they certainly didn't get used to it during Joe Biden's term.
Well, Tam, stick with us because I'm going to call you back for our discussion period. But I want to turn now to our second panelist, E.J. Dionne, who is not just a veteran political columnist for the Washington Post. He's also a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, and he's a professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture at Georgetown University. E.J., it's good to see you again.
Always good to see you, Robert. Thank you.
So far, what to you is most remarkable about the second act of the Trump era?
Just to give people a sense of how wild and unpredictable things are in Washington, while Tam was speaking, talking about the conflict between the White House, who said the press misinterpreted this executive order from OMB, this order from OMB, or no, it was the Trump problem. A federal judge in Rhode Island settled that. As we were speaking, or just shortly before, a U.S. District Judge, Jack McConnell, called the spending freeze hugely ambiguous. And he said, just to be sure, he too will stop it from taking effect. So things are happening very quickly. I think if I were to point to the most disturbing things that have happened in the first week or so, I think it is the combination of the pardoning of all the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th, including attacks on police officers, combined with removing the protections from people who've been critical of Trump, Anthony Fauci, John Bolton, a conservative Republican, and also Mike Pompeo, his former Secretary of State. They were being protected from various threats. Trump said they're not protected anymore. And it really was a kind of chilling message. If you commit violence, break the law on behalf of Trump, he'll have your back. If you go after him, you lose your protection. So I think that's the first. The second are all of these firings that seem to violate the civil service law or other provisions, firing a whole group of inspectors general who are supposed to be on the lookout for corruption and waste, fraud, and abuse. And the president is supposed to give Congress 30 days notice before he lets them go. He didn't do that. Pushing out a whole lot of prosecutors, assistant attorneys general, prosecutors at the Justice Department who handled the Biden case. These are sort of very partisan things, really part of an administration that I think has pretty much been clear that it'll be about payback. And then came this botched executive order, which I think among all of these things finally ignited Democrats as no other nothing else he had done had. They've been very critical of this or that. But this was felt all over the country in every congressional district where people couldn't, officials couldn't get money for childcare or Medicaid or schools. It was, it was a national thing. And I think Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut summarized rather succinctly the kinds of things Democrats are saying. He said it was very typical of the Trump administration, a combination of brutality and incompetence. And I think that's the last point about these orders. They are written in such ideological and campaign language. Talk about Marxism, Green New Deal. They are not traditional government documents.
Yeah, you mentioned the pardons first, and I'm curious what you made of the decision to simply offer blanket pardons. There were some that had commutations of sentence, but for the most part, there was not a review of people, which could have been done. There was a man who was just shot and killed by police in Indiana, who had been one of those pardoned, and had a long rap sheet in Indiana, as it turned out. I mean, he was shot for disobeying a cop's orders at a traffic stop. But I didn't think that anybody would have extended a pardon to somebody with that record. What did you make of the? Who cares? Let's just give them all a pardon.
Well, I think, first of all, it put his pre-pardon defenders in a difficult position. Pam Bondi, his appointee for Attorney General, when she testified, said, oh, well, there will be a careful process for this. There should be a careful process. A number of other senators said, well, he shouldn't pardon people, and I'm sure he won't pardon people who attacked police officers. And he turned around and pardoned them all. And he was asked about why he pardoned those who had attacked police officers. And he said, and I'm not quoting directly here, but it would have been too complicated to look into it. So he decided to just do them all. And I think it was, it's the in-your-faceness was on purpose to send a message about how he feels about January 6th. And I think it's part of what people, as you know, are calling shock and awe, a strategy of doing so many things, being quite extreme, doing it all at once, to kind of push back the opposition. And of course, shock and awe didn't work so well in Iraq in the long run. But I think for a while, it did have people sort of pushed back a little because it wasn't clear what they should respond to. I think after a week of this, I think the organizing and the pushback is started to come, and I think it'll continue to come.
I just, before going on to our third panelist, I just want to ask you about the Democrats and whether we should expect any new thinking in the Democratic Party, looking back on their defeat in November. What is the mood in the party? Is it that, it's another close election? This time the pendulum swung their way, it'll swing back to us one of these days again? Or we've missed the boat. People really don't like the idea of lots of undocumented immigrants in the country, and people aren't all that keen on DEI either. What do you make of the Democrats reassessing themselves?
I think what really disturbed the Democrats is that in the previous elections, not only against Joe Biden, but also against Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump lost the popular vote. In this election, he won all the swing states. He won the popular vote. And Trump gained ground in 89% of the counties in the country. And what's happened is you've seen a debate among Democrats and, in the country generally, is this a really big deal or as you suggested, is this just a swing of the pendulum, slightly in the Republicans' favor? He won the popular vote by 1.5, 1.6%, which was less than Hillary Clinton beat him by in the popular vote in 2016. And I think that debate goes on, but I think it's kind of useless. I think that, it was the best, what to call it, as a Democratic pollster said, it's not about whether it's everything is lost or it's really a small defeat, but it was a consequential defeat. And it was consequential because the Republicans took both houses. It was consequential because Democrats suffered more losses in the working class. It was consequential because they lost substantial ground among Latino voters. And I think those are the things Democrats are talking about as needing to act on and reverse. I think that Trump, by his very aggressiveness in the first week, has given Democrats a lot they can do, a lot they can talk about before they do a fundamental reassessment. I think you're going to see Democrats thinking, why have we lost the working class? What do we do about cultural issues, particularly trans? View that President Biden didn't act quickly enough to secure the border on immigration. But just to come back to where you were earlier with Tam on prices, I think you're going to hear every day about eggs, about coffee, about all sorts of consumer products. And the argument is that Trump really did, in the end, win this election because of prices and immigration. He's certainly being aggressive on immigration. But if he doesn't move prices, you're going to hear a lot about that from the Democrats. And I think they're also going to keep a careful eye on the billionaires who are prominent in this administration. Is he representing the working class voters who voted for him in large numbers? And I think you're going to hear a lot from Democrats about the fact that he isn't, including, just for example, firing Democrats on the National Labor Relations Board, which will hurt unions because the board doesn't have a quorum anymore. And as one labor leader told a friend of mine, we have no labor law in our country right now because the NLRB can't enforce it. So I think he's giving the Democrats a lot to talk about while they figure out how to fix what went wrong.
EJ, stick around because in about 10 minutes we'll start our discussion period. Our third panelist is Evan Osnos, a staff writer for The New Yorker and co-host of the magazine's Political Scene podcast. Evan's book, Wildland, described America's political dissolution and the resulting fury that's come to infuse our politics. A former China correspondent, his book about contemporary Chinese life, Age of Ambition, won a National Book Award. His earlier reporting earned him a share of 2 Pulitzers. Evan, thanks for joining us once again. It's good to see you.
My pleasure, Robert. Thanks for having me.
You have a very good sense of how the texture of everyday life relates to the plans and policies of government and politicians. So explain this one to me. Donald Trump is often called a populist who expresses or plays upon the frustrations of people who feel they've been ignored by government. So who got the good seats at his inauguration? Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook of Apple, Sundar Pichai of Google. Some of the least ignored people in America were his star guests. What's going on here?
Well, you raise a couple of really essential observations. I think one is that the nature of his populism has shifted over time. I was just reading some research that's just come out that looks at the way that he talked in 2016 when he was a candidate versus the way he talked in 2024. And what scholars who study this kind of subtle shading of populist language will tell you is that he went from an inclusive form of populism, where he was talking about we, and he was sort of identifying, kind of banding together an imagined community, to what they now call an exclusive populism. And if you actually just count up the number of times he talked about this unnamed group of enemies, that was higher than any previous presidential candidate we've ever encountered. In fact, many much higher. So there's a way in which he was running this time less on an announced set of affirmative ambitions than it was about defining who it is your enemy, what sort of negative partisanship. Now, that I think to your second point, what's important to recognize is that those oligarchs, that if we take that scene that was so visible on Inauguration Day, where the three of the wealthiest men in the world were in the front row, and then in the second row, of course, you had his nominees for the cabinet, that was in fact also a bit of a roadmap to the fault lines in the Trump coalition. If we're really thinking about what should we be looking at in the year ahead, what are some of the dynamics that could determine what does and does not happen in political and policy terms, you have baked in at the moment a fundamental contradiction, depending on how you define it, a hypocrisy. You've got, on the one hand, people like Steve Bannon in Trump's wider orbit, who is determined to blunt the impact of big tech, as he would say. You've got elements within J.D. Vance's orbit, people who have been determined to go after large companies who are quite in favor of the vigorous antitrust position that the Biden administration staked out. And yet at the same time, then you also have Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, folks who would would be very resistant to the idea of going after quote unquote big tech. And so at some point, and you've already begun to see some of these things play out when you have somebody like Vivek Ramaswamy already has left the Department of Government Efficiency. So I think it depends which piece of that coalition ends up prevailing and enduring may help us understand more about the priorities and ultimately the policy impact.
Your next book is on oligarchy. I would share the title, but I'm afraid that you don't want it out there in the.
That's all right. People can tune in again in a few months, and they'll find out about it.
You're interested in inequality in American life, and I wonder, is it actually a major animating force of our politics? That is, do we have people who truly resent enormous wealth? Or do so many Americans believe that they've got that 1 in 100 chance of getting rich, that they're on the side of the group that they aspire to be part of? How does inequality play out in American political thinking these days?
Yeah, it's a great question, Robert, because it does. We as Americans have this very complex and in some ways ambivalent position. It's. We are, as a country, as an idea, we were founded on the concept of rejecting nobility, rejecting inherited privilege that was the hallmark of Europe. And it was very much in the way that people like Thomas Jefferson wrote and thought about this country, the idea that we had to make sure that we were blunting the effect of inherited power and privilege, because it would, as he put it, it would blunt our ambition, both individually and ultimately as a country. So Americans are divided. And I think if you look over the full scope of history, what you find is that there are periods when we are quite energized by, fascinated by accomplishments of great wealth, the idea that people can go from nothing to something. But there is also within us a kind of unannounced limit beyond which it begins to offend our sense of the American idea and the American dream. And part of that comes down to mobility. If it is that you, in fact, can no longer achieve this imagined goal, then it becomes a hugely powerful and electric political negative. And right now, depending on the data, but it's pretty clear across the board, a child born in 1940, for instance, had about a 90% chance of out-earning their parents. A child born today has less than a 40% chance. So this is not abstract. And I think, though people sometimes frame it in terms of other issues that are more proximate to them on a daily basis, they might say that they're angry about immigration. They might say that they're angry about the price of eggs. A lot of times, the underground river there is the sheer gap of wealth and income.
Evan, I want to take advantage of your knowledge of China won't spend much of the red balance of the hour talking about it, but I'm curious. I mean, do you expect a new and militant policy towards China, or is militance reserved for countries like Colombia and Greenland in the Trump administration?
I'm glad you mentioned it because in some ways, if we're going to pick one international relationship that could be consequential economically and politically over the course of the next 4 years, it's how does he handle China? China is watching very, very closely. I think broadly speaking, they are happy to see us preoccupied with our own internal political dramas. This is always useful. If we're focused on this, if we're hiving off parts of the federal workforce, that means we're not doing things like investing in long-range development of AI or semiconductors and things like that. But they are also listening closely to what Trump says. And perhaps in some ways, it may turn out that the most consequential sentence of the 2024 campaign was not one that anybody paid a whole lot of attention to in our usual political conversations. It was when Trump mentioned in an interview that he thought, Taiwan, as he said, is over 9,000 miles away from us here. Do we really have much of a stake in that issue? And if you're in Beijing and you're hearing an American president begin to describe the fact that he doesn't think we have a natural relationship there with Taiwan, that begins to factor into those calculations. And that is a theme I would leave this just to end this discussion, this point, that when Trump says things about whether it's China or about Canada, for instance, and beginning to, let's say, land some blows on what has been a core relationship to American national security and allowed many of the things for us that we take for granted, that may not an immediate effect, but over time it figures into their politics and their decision making in ways that are hard to anticipate in the present.
Evan Osnos, thank you. And stick around. I'd like to call back E.J. Dionne and Tamara Keith right now for all of us to be here for the second half hour. And let me put a question. I'll start with Tam, but I'd be curious to hear what either of you gentlemen think about it. Also, Greenland. I mean, it's Donald Trump returns to it and expresses the serious necessity for us of at least controlling Greenland, and I suppose offering, is it citizenship to the 57,000 people who live in Greenland, or do Danes get it too? I don't know. Anyway, how serious is his talk about Greenland?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I will say it was very much a punchline in Trump 1, though he did talk about it briefly in public. It was a punchline. In Trump 2, he is more serious. In his inaugural address, he talked about manifest destiny.
Was manifest destiny gets us to Mars? Was his use?
Well, we have an expansion of our territory.
Yes,
yes, Mars and Canada, the 51st state, and the way he talks about Canada is still very jokey, but the way he talks about Greenland is less so. And I think that he is talking about, underlying all of this, there are real issues about control of resources and control of territory and all of these things. But, we're also in a phase of sort of the world order where self-determination is a value that is widely accepted. And Greenlanders, at least according to one poll I saw, don't actually want to leave their current status.
Yeah.
They're not eager to be gobbled up by America.
I just like to read what President Trump said in his inaugural address. This is reading from it. The United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons. I guess, there are moments when I think I feel here in Northern Virginia, where I live, that I don't get to do reporting trips to Southern Ohio anymore. I'm retired. So there are lots of people in America whom I don't get to sit down and talk with and listen to. But EJ, you tell me, is there any interest out there in America for adding territory to the United States? Is it a quiet desire for expansion that I'm just not picking up on?
I don't think Greenland, Canada, or the Panama Canal were on the bingo cards of anybody who voted for Donald Trump in the last election. I mean, there's in parts of the right wing Panama, the Panama Canal is still there. But I was really struck when Evan was talking. I was thinking about this, that Trump has spoken with much more hostility about our allies than he has about any of our adversaries. Panama is an ally. Canada is one of our closest allies. Denmark has been a loyal ally, and these are the folks he's going after. And I think this is a presidency inspired by James K. Polk, and who massively expanded the landmass that was the U.S. after the Mexican War, and William McKinley, who expanded our holdings after the Spanish-American War. But I think that if you want to be really worried about all this, I think what this sometimes feels like it signals is we'll have the U.S. sphere of influence. We will expand where we expand. And will China and Russia interpret this in any way as Trump saying, you take your spheres of influence? What does this say until Trump clarifies it, which I hope he will, about Ukraine or Taiwan? It is a really remarkable thing. I mean, there is an issue underlying this, if you want to take it very seriously, that with climate change, there is a Chinese and Russian presence up near Greenland, which might be a case for strengthening American troops up there or more control of the seas. There are things you could say that are not crazy about this, but the idea of just a takeover of a huge nation with 55,000 people in it is just not anything Americans have thought about other than Donald Trump, I think.
Evan, thoughts on this? Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, Tam.
I was just going to add a very quick thought, which is that just because it wasn't on anyone's bingo card doesn't mean that once Trump starts talking about it, his supporters don't get on board. They very much get excited about what he's excited about. And even if it's just, like a meme or a joke that we're going to take over Greenland, suddenly it becomes theirs. And so he puts things into the bloodstream that weren't there before.
I think I
agree with that.
A really important point. Tam has pointed us to the fact, and this is something I was going to get at, that in a way, part of what he's doing, by the way, is serving what seems to us like an esoteric piece of his coalition, but it is something there, which is they have these ideas. They have these ideas about what they would say sort of reinvigorating the imperial and really the language they're using is a kind of masculine warrior ethic in the American heritage. These are all words that are coming out of their writings. Now, look, I am quite suspicious of any attempt to try to intellectualize what is, I think, a fairly blunt instrument when you're talking about Trump's ideas. But when he's talking about this, it's sometimes we think, oh, well, this is him just throwing out a wacky object. But in fact, he is, as Tam indicated, he's both drawing on something in his cosmos of ideas, and then he is also establishing something in the mind of the casual retail voter. Essentially, it's the, not to be too reductive about it, but it's the Comet Pizza effect of politics, where you take something that literally has nothing to it and you introduce it into the digestion, and all of a sudden now it becomes a permanent feature of Trump politics. And that's something to be wary of, because these imperial impulses they're of a piece with a broader set of ideas that animate Trumpism 2.0.
Here's a question from a viewer, James Glazier. This is apropos of impoundment and not spending money that's been appropriated. He asks, honestly, didn't Biden do essentially the same by holding back congressionally approved arms shipments to Israel?
I don't have the law in front of me. Yes. I think that what is different is that the order that Trump put out affected everything, including, by the way, the military, which was having some trouble with its suppliers of weapons, as well as from military to childcare. It was such a sweeping order that it went way beyond what Biden did. And as I say, I think Biden has some authority on weapons that he legally used, but somebody out there can double check the law for me.
Yeah, I doubt that the munitions themselves by type and name were included in legislation. I think the legislation is
I also think it's interesting to remind ourselves that Russ Vought, who is now was and is still OMB director under Trump, budget director, that he actually in his hearing questioned the constitutionality of the Impoundment Control Act, meaning that it's actually an affirmative ambition to get this in front of the Supreme Court. You know, as Trump's mentor Roy Cohn used to say, "Don't tell me what the law is, tell me who the judge is." Yeah.
Does the political alignment as it's worked out, which is a so-called trifecta, that is, there was a very broad, if shallow, victory last fall, which has left the Republicans in control of both houses of Congress, but the margin in the House is as thin as you can get. Can this Congress, or would this Congress in some way, approve extending Trump's tax cuts? Is that obviously in the cards, or is it obviously blocked by enough numbers that Democrats have to prevent that from happening? Tam, what's your judgment?
I feel like it's probably too big to fail, too important, too big to too many Republican constituencies to allow it to go down. And the question, though, is how do they do it? How much teeth gnashing is involved? How many fits and starts are involved? Do they try to link it to raising the debt ceiling? Do they give up on that? Just sort of the sausage making of it. I don't know that it is necessarily going to be perfectly smooth, but I am reminded of the last time that Trump was president and Republicans passed this big tax cut, which they now need to extend. It's going to expire if they don't extend it, and they want to expand it too. And it looked pretty dead until it didn't look dead at all. And this is just something that is so fundamental to what he campaigned on, what they all believe in, that I can't imagine them ultimately tripping over their own feet.
I think that's right. But the difficulties are enormous with this small majority because you have very different interests operating. You have, a number of Republicans from Democratic states that have high taxes, California, New York, New Jersey, who say they won't vote for anything that doesn't increase, give back some of the deductibility of state and local taxes, which means a lot to people in their states, which the rest of the party doesn't like. You have the right wing that will say all of this has to be offset with spending cuts. How far will that go? Because if you offset this whole tax cut with spending cuts that were real, you'd eviscerate lots of parts of government that are very popular. And then you have all kinds of members. There was a good story in the Wall Street Journal the other day. We're carrying around these very specific, interest, cuts for interests in their own states. So I think it's going to be very complicated, and they can't count on a lot of help from Democrats. Where I think it's going to get really sticky is on when it comes time to raise the debt ceiling, because Democrats are signaling now that they won't help the Republicans on the debt ceiling unless the Republicans give them something substantial. There are probably at least a half dozen Republicans who don't want to vote for any debt ceiling increase. This will be a really interesting crisis point or a choosing point for Trump. Will he give the Democrats anything substantial to prevent what could be a financial catastrophe from not raising the debt ceiling?
I think also what EJ is raising is an important tonal fact, temperamental fact about Washington, which is that because Trump has adopted the shock and awe approach, that it is in its way a strategic calculation that they're going to do as much as they possibly can without Democratic involvement. And that may be a sugar high approach, meaning, if you go out and you alienate Democrats as enthusiastically as they're doing right now, it's only a matter of time. I don't have the debt ceiling deadline in front of me, but given the way things are going, I don't know when it is, but it can only be weeks or months away. And at that point, you're going to have very few people on the Democratic side who are going to be willing to give up any political capital for this. It is, in its way, it's a political gamble. And Trump, as we all know from the first term, tends to live day to day, strategically speaking. And it may be that this position that they've taken now could end up being costly down the line.
I have this feeling that there's a generational divide in the country. I don't know if any of you share this, but a person who's in his or her 40s right now has grown up knowing 9/11 and two wars that grow out of it, a disastrous recession that I remember when I interviewed people of that age group several years ago. The number of people whose families relocated to have to find a job was really quite substantial, and it hurt a lot. These people did not have any memory of a wonderful old way, the way things used to be. They didn't have E.J. You're in my 1950s to remember, or even the early 1960s. Part of the country remembers a very powerful, wealthy country where life was quite happy and suburbs were quite safe. And another big chunk of the country has never experienced that. In fact, inflation, you have to be our age, EJ, for this not have been your first encounter with inflation, which it was for the vast majority of Americans. And I wonder if part of what's happening is a generation that just doesn't have good old days to be appealed to, taking charge.
I can't tell you, Robert, how often I've thought of this about this question, because our kids are 32, 30, and 27. And I think when they were born in the 1990s, when things were going well, we were at peace, the economy was booming. I said, this is great. Our kids will have a shot at having something like the period you and I grew up in. And then along comes 9/11, along comes the economic crash of 2008, along come endless wars. They knew the country at war for such a long time. And then along comes Donald Trump. What a shocking set of events to grow up with. And I do think that there is a very different generational attitude toward a whole lot of things. I think there's probably more willingness among people under 40 to really, I won't say overthrow, but to be exceedingly critical of the system we have, and certainly not to be able to hold on to those memories we had when Republicans and Democrats, got along better. They could argue with each other without having something like January 6th happen. So I agree. I think that there's some great studies to be done about that generational difference in the country. And I've talked about it a lot with our kids, and they feel it themselves.
Yeah, I would argue that we have not fully, as a country, as a culture, taken full stock of how disruptive 2008 was, like how terrible that was, how just the long-term effect on people's lives and livelihoods, and the way they feel about the being able to get ahead or get a fair shake. And I think that then you add COVID on top of that. And those are two massive global disruptions that I think that we kind of undervalue in our politics and in our political analysis, but that ultimately are just massive disruptions.
Yeah, I don't think we have fully come to terms with the impact of the pandemic. You're so right to raise that. And I think it's still working through the society. Evan, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, to that point, I mean, there was a great reference. I think it was in the Wall Street Journal at one point. Somebody described COVID as producing a kind of referred pain in the sense that we experienced it in all these other ways. We thought we were lonely, we thought we were frustrated in inflation, and so on. A lot of it was COVID direct. To this really important age point, demographic point that Robert raised, when I was writing a lot about Joe Biden, I was often reminded of the fact that demographically speaking, he was born in this really specific band of American experience that demographers call the lucky few, meaning that if you were born around 1942 when he was, and let's face it, if you were a white male as Joe Biden was, that you grew up with a really distinct sense of what the country could deliver and what it was and what he was capable of. And he expressed that very often in his politics. And what he would talk about was getting back to something. And to your point, Robert, though, I think the median American today is a millennial. He's the median American. She is 38 years old and has never really known a lot of the things that Biden was trying to reimagine or express. And that was some of the disconnect, along with some of the more obvious elements of the disconnect over age with him.
One other point I want to raise with all of you and hear from you about is the state of the Republican Party. Is there an old Republican Party, a traditional Republican Party that is represented to some extent in the Congress, or at least in governorships or somewhere? Or is MAGA now the Republican Party? Does the second Trump administration more or less put paid to the remnants of people who would have thought that Ronald Reagan was the new beginning of the Republican?
The way I read it is you probably have in the Congress maybe 20%, maybe 25% of Republicans who are in some way part of that old party. And remember, enough of them did vote to restore Ukraine aid, and there was enough pressure on Speaker Johnson under Biden to let Ukraine aid go forward. I think that speaks to that part of the party. But they are shrinking, and they are especially shrinking in the Republican electorate, because when you look at this election and the Obama and Clinton and Biden elections, you see enormous hemorrhaging of Republican votes in old, moderate, suburban Republican strongholds, like the collar counties around Philadelphia are a good example of that. And so I think the problem is not just for this old-style Republicanism, is not just in the Congress, but the electorate itself is now much more MAGA than one would ever imagine it would become when Donald Trump came down that escalator.
Yeah, it's his party. It is very much his party. And the fact that, Mitch McConnell is joining the resistance, or whatever you want to call it, on one of these nominees. I mean, McConnell is part of that same class, age demographic, came into politics and was involved in politics at a different time as Joe Biden. And McConnell just happens to be pretty much the last man standing. I guess Chuck Grassley is also there. He gently pushed back on the firing of the inspectors general, gently, but not with any severity. He didn't hold up any nominations, for instance, or use any of the tactics that a Republican senator could. I don't see a lot of, we'll see what happens with Tulsi Gabbard, for instance, who I think gives a lot of discomfort to a lot of people, Republicans and Democrats alike. She was a Democrat. She has a very interesting history and interesting views on national security that are out of line with even more Trumpy versions of like national security republicanism. So we'll see, but Trump made it very clear that he would use recess appointments or do incredible stress tests to the system if Republicans didn't go along and give him what he wanted. And, other than Matt Gaetz, which was, not, it's surprising he lasted the hours that he lasted as the pick. But other than Matt Gaetz, many of these nominees who, are just, they really are testing them. They're really testing Republican senators, and Trump is winning. The Republican senators have not shown the stomach to want to say, hey, could you go back to the drawing board and get us someone that's a little bit more experienced or whatever. They aren't pushing back. And so Trump is very likely to get the cabinet that he wants, which, are straight out of central casting, deliver the message he wants delivered.
I'm just curious, do you think there are conversations in advance of naming nominees with John Thune or with somebody in leadership to say, is this, just let me know if this can fly or not? And,
they moved very fast on these, very fast.
We don't often talk about it in this way, but Trump is already a lame duck president. He doesn't, obviously, it's early, but this is his, assuming, except for the possibility of extraordinary intervention, this is his last term as president. So what happens to the party after that? Who is the heir? Is there somebody? Is it J.D. Vance, or does it go in another direction? And one thing I think we would all very emphatically agree on is that, Washington is a place where there is a lot of instinct for entrepreneurship. If somebody in the Senate, all of whom, every senator wakes up every morning, whistling hail to the chief, imagining they could be. So one of them is going to get that idea that they're going to find a little seam within this coalition and begin to define themselves. And that's one of the interesting things to look for, I think.
I'm glad that we're ending on this note, because I'm going to ask you for just like almost a show of hands here to reassure some people. There are Democrats or Trump critics out there who do not believe that Donald Trump will in fact leave office after 4 years. And I have told some of these people, the letter, the explicit language in the 14th Amendment about birthright citizenship is nothing compared to the amendment specifically added to prevent people from serving more than two terms. But I just wanted to check. You do assume that the notion of Donald Trump getting a third term is impossible?
I think that no candidates and no journalists should ever just raise hands anymore answering a question. But what I think is Trump will play around with it. There is a Republican in Congress who's introduced a constitutional amendment. I don't think even the most pro-Trump judge can read that amendment in any other way, saying he's got to get out of office at the end of this term. But I think he's going to signal that he wants to do it all the way through. I think in the end, you're probably going to be right. But I've been so wrong about everything having to do with Trump that I just don't make any predictions anymore where he is concerned.
And as soon as he starts calling himself a lame duck, he'll actually start being perceived as one.
And
that's true.
And Evan, you're not in agreement to that?
No, exactly. I'm from the E.J. Dionne school of prognostication, which is we have all learned so many times over in the last decade just how much is impossible to predict. But for the Republic, I sure hope that he honors the Constitution and leaves after one term.
Well, I'd like to.
I turned in my card in the Prognosticators Union at about midnight on election night in 2016. So
yeah, but there's no labor law right now. So
exactly.
Okay. Well, listen, I want to thank all three of you for a fascinating conversation. E.J. Dionne and Tam Keith and Evan Osnos. And many thanks as well to Joshua Plout and Ronnie Giuliano from American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, which produces Global Connections, and to our technical director, Bobby Grandone. Our program sponsor is the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. It's a 501c3 national charitable organization representing in the United States Israel's biggest hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petach Tikva, Greater Tel Aviv. The website is www.afrmc.org. I'm Robert Siegel, and this has been Global Connections, Navigating the New Normal. See you next month. Stay healthy and stay safe.